I got nauseous several times while tidying up the kitchen. The dough wasn't particularly easy to carry, and the flies and the stench didn't help. At some point, I just sort of mentally disconnected from everything. My mind was somewhere far, far away, while my hands picked up and scrubbed the plates and wiped the blood off the table. My legs carried me out the door as I dragged the dough outside, leaving a bald valley in the fresh snow as I crossed the yard with the cadaver in tow. My back was starting to hurt. I let go of the dough and straightened up to stretch, only to bump into someone who'd been standing right behind me. I whipped my head around to find myself face to face with the Leshy, who had mercifully adopted his human form, lest I would have likely suffered cardiac arrest. "Bringing me food there, Eris?" He pointed at the dough. "Well, you can have it, I guess," I muttered, still sort of shaken. "You'd just give me shit otherwise, right?" Oops. Probably shouldn't talk like that to the Lord of the Woods. It had kinda just slipped out. I was still in a daze, my tongue acting on its own. I was already preparing for hell to break loose, but the Leshy actually started smiling. "Oh, I'll give you more than enough shit in your lifetime, Fiona." Fiona. Hearing my name from him was always beyond eerie. I gritted my teeth but refrained from commenting. "But not now," the Leshy clarified graciously. "Although I do like company while I eat." He cocked his head. "Please no," I mumbled wearily. His smile grew wider as he pointed at the ground. "Sit." I sighed very deeply before gathering my skirt at my sides and plopping down. I tried not to watch as the Leshy knelt down, setting his cudgel aside and reaching out his hand, proceeding to plunge it into the carcass, somehow instantly piercing the skin. His fingers coaxed a disgusting squelching noise from the dough's insides as he started rummaging around in them. Just as I thought the sound was going to make me throw up again, he pulled his arm back out, producing something red and drippy. It took me a while to realize it was the dough's heart. He held it out to me. "Take a bite," he invited. "No thanks." "Take a bite," the Leshy repeated. "Thanks, but seriously, no." "Fiona." This time it sounded like a threat, so I started crying. The Leshy just kinda looked at me with wide eyes before sinking his teeth into the heart himself, chewing pensively. "What's wrong?" he asked, not bothering to swallow before speaking up. I kept bawling, gurgling incoherently. The wood demon was beginning to look a little put off, but he didn't stop eating. We must have been quite a sight sitting there together. I think I was starting to make him uncomfortable, if he was able to feel something of the sort. There, he said softly, still chewing as he rose to his feet. "Relax. I need you to hold still for a moment." Somehow I was overcome by the sudden urge to obey. He grabbed my face and pried my mouth open. I was too shocked to move, it just happened so fast. He leaned down and spat the stinking, foul red mush his teeth had turned the dough's heart into right down my throat. He held my gaze the entire time, clasping my mouth shut the second the last bit of red had landed on my tongue. My fear reflected in his steely eyes. Tears kept on rolling down my face. "You need to swallow now." I shook my head, letting out a choked sob as I tried to ignore the rotten taste. "I'm not letting you go until you swallow." He sighed, readjusting his grip. "Come on, don't make this any harder than it needs to be. Trust me, you'll thank me for this." Something about his tone was oddly disarming. I squeezed my eyes shut, grimaced, and gulped it down. He removed his hand and I stuck out my tongue to prove there was nothing left. The effect hit me immediately, as I was overcome by a serene, pulse-slowing calmness. The tension disappeared from my shoulders, and I let go of a long breath, wiping the tears from my puffy red cheeks. "Feels good, don't it?" the Leshy asked. "This is sure to make me sick," I grumbled. "It won't. Sure, it'd be tastier if it were fresher, but it serves the same purpose. The flesh of a dough from these woods steals the nerves when consumed raw." "Huh? Why'd you have to make me eat the heart, though?" He looked seriously puzzled. "Well, because it's the best part?" Shaking his head at my cluelessness, he added, "I saw your mother slay this one last night. She looked quite out of it, waltzing through the darkness with that machete on her." "I think she's dying," I blurted out. "I don't know what's going on with her. She seemed fine yesterday, but then she started talking about the Huldefolk, whatever that is, And now she's just gone completely crazy. She's not making any sense. I had to catch my breath before carrying on, but the Leshy merely held up a hand, cutting me off. I'll warn you not to speak too loudly of the Holderfolk. There are forces here that even I find difficult to control. He paused, regarding me with something akin to pity. I understand that this will be hard for you, gentle soul, but trust that all pain and grief shall pass someday. That's what I'll leave you with. Return to your mother, stay by her side, and if you can, bid her farewell from me too. So she really is going to die? The Holderfolk have to pay their toll to hell, Harris. He stood up, and to my surprise helped me to my feet. I'll take the carcass off your hands. What belongs in the woods will be mine again. Run along, wench. Not wanting to overstay my welcome, I headed back to the house as fast as I could. I didn't think that the Leshy had lied to me, and that assumption was confirmed when I heard a hair-raising cry the moment I burst through the front door. It was my mother's voice, agonized and frightened, coming from inside the master bedroom. I found my father at the top of the staircase, looking down at me and frantically motioning for me to hurry. We hastened down the hallway together, telling the girls to stay in their rooms as they briefly stuck their heads out. We shoved open the bedroom door just in time to see Mom crawling off the bed on her hands and feet, facing the ceiling in a grotesque, spider-like manner, howling like a banshee. It was probably the most horrifically gruesome sight I ever had the displeasure of beholding, but the doe's heart had not yet ceased to affect me. The unnatural, relentless calm allowed me to break through my mental fog and rush to my mother's side, gathering her frail, writhing body in my arms and forcing her into a hug. Dad was screaming. In fact, he couldn't stop screaming. He was clawing at the skin of his own face, tugging on his hair and wailing, until I turned and told him to finally shut up. I understood the sentiment perfectly, but some daughterly instinct of mine told me that these were my mother's last moments. I didn't want her to meet her death surrounded by panic and despair. Mom, I whispered to her as the haze in her eyes lit up. Her chapped lips stretched into a wan smile. She didn't say anything, merely grasped my arm with her fingers. Her hand was incredibly cold. I pulled her a little closer and she let out a low moan. Fiona, she rasped out, Mommy, I'm here. Is it okay? Sure, everything's okay, Mom. Fiona, I'll be going now. I know. Are you... Her voice faltered and she swallowed. Gonna be okay? I'll be fine, Mommy. I buried my face in the crook of her neck as she weakly wrapped her arms around my shoulders. See you when you're ready, honey, she muttered into my ear before her head dropped onto my chest. I sat there on the floor, cradling her until I was afraid her body would begin to stiffen. I laid her out on the bed. Her eyes were shut, her mouth slightly curved. I hadn't expected this, but she actually looked peaceful. The minutes preceding her death had been fearful and excruciating, but the moment itself had been harmonious. The ground was frozen and rock hard when Dad and I dug out the grave. It wasn't easy, but we managed. We laid her to rest beneath the red meadow, calling everyone she was close with as well as the extended family. Jem didn't show up, but Cass obviously came, and so did Mom's sisters and brothers from out of state. We hosted a small gathering at our house. Cass and the girls cried their eyes out. Dad kept his composure during the funeral service, but afterwards he was never the same. No matter how often they'd fought, no matter how many times Mom had cussed him out and he'd compared her to other women, her demise left him adrift and just utterly shattered. As soon as my sisters were out of the house, he moved to some sunny place where he could ogle bikini babes and pretend he hadn't lost the love of his life. So I told all this to Jacek as we sat on the couch. Most of it, at least. I'm really sorry, he said when I concluded my report. I didn't mean to tear open any old wounds. I regarded him with a tilted head. You haven't seen Mom down there by any chance, have you? In hell? No, that's not quite how it works. Not everybody gets that kind of an afterlife. His eyes were glistening a little. Sorry, he repeated, stealthily wiping the moisture away. It's cool. Cass had wrapped his arms around me from behind, his chin on my shoulder. "Come here, man. Triple hug. I know she meant a lot to you." Jacek gave him a weird look, but after a moment of consideration, very briefly joined us to form a warm, comfortable sandwich. After a few seconds, he drew back and awkwardly cleared his throat. "Two things. Remember that dog I had with me sometimes?" "Sure do." "It's not still around by any chance, is it?" "Yeah," I replied. "We ran into it a couple days ago. Seemed to miss you a lot. It still knew me." "Huh. Who would have guessed? I thought it hated the surface. Always considered myself selfish for summoning it in the first place. Wow, I feel like twice as shitty now." He coughed. "Anyways, second question, did you ever find out more about the Holdu folk?" "Nope." "Well, no matter." A sly grin began to unfurl on his lips. "I might have an idea." Telling Jacek the story of my mother's death was exceptionally painful, but turned out to be a pretty good decision. He said that he'd go get the dog after we'd finished our talk. I made him wait until I'd texted my employees that there'd be a man dressed in all black walking around in the woods today, and not to stop him. The older ones, namely Jose and Gus, still remembered the Dark Miller, so I actually got replies from them asking if he was back to stay now. Casimir and I stayed in the comfort of the house, busying ourselves with negligible chores and planning until he returned. "Incoming," Cass announced upon glancing out the window. I stepped out onto the porch to find Jacek crossing the red meadow. Jumping around him was the big black dog, nuzzling him and drooling everywhere. It sat down in front of the porch, waiting politely as the miller walked up to us. "Here's my plan," he began, raking a hand through slobbered-on hair. "Steal something from this Tom Hayes person. Anything. Can be a hat, a couple hairs, a goddamn shoelace, whatever. You give that to me and Licorice will do the rest." "Licorice," I echoed. Right, that was his name. Casimir shuddered as he threw a glance at the creature happily rolling around in the snow. "Why would you give your creepy-ass zombie dog such a cute name? That's just kind of jarring, no?" "Well, Casimir Novak, it just so happens to be my creepy-ass zombie dog, and I can name it whatever I want," Jacek replied with an easy chuckle. "Also a little more respect. He's a good boy. He's gonna save your sorry butts. Hellhounds are made to rally stray souls." I wasn't entirely sure where he was going with this, but it seemed that he wasn't quite done with his instructions either. "Once this Tom Hayes has no leverage anymore, you can fire him or kill him. I'll leave that up to you. Your problem's bigger than him though, isn't it? You need to cover this whole thing up again. Maybe we should take care of that first." I nodded, watching as Jacek started chewing on his lower lip and thought. "I have a possible solution. At least a temporary one until it's all blown over and people start forgetting about you again," he said. "But you won't like it." I told him I was open for anything, and he smiled. "That's good. So, do you think you trust me enough to do something intense?" "Intense how?" His grin widened. "Going to hell." Cass and I simply stared at him for a couple seconds. He stared back, inkwell eyes sparkling. My little brother took a swift step back, raising his hands. "Nope, sorry buddy, not happening. Take my sister. She's into that sort of thing, but I'm like, not... Come on, it's awesome down there, you'll love... Nope, I'm not going. Fiona gets horny when she's scared. She'll have a hell of a time, but I'd prefer to keep my head on my shoulders." I stepped on his foot hard. "I told you that in confidence," I hissed. "Just sometimes," I corrected, addressing my ex. "You people are sick," Jacek said cheerfully. "So Fiona, this is about your land. What'll it be?" "Oh, I'm doing this," I confirmed. "But purely historically speaking, I know you like sending me into things blindfolded. So what exactly is our plan here?" "What's it matter?" Jacek drawled, reaching into his pocket to pull out a pack of cigarettes. He placed one between his lips, then snapped his fingers a few times until a tiny flame appeared, hovering above his knuckles. He used it to light his smoke. "You only have to convince a friend of mine that your woods are worth protecting. You'd go to that length to save your forest, right?" he mumbled, not fully opening his mouth so the cigarette wouldn't fall out. "I didn't know you started smoking," I pressed out, hurriedly tearing my eyes from his lips when he looked up. Dreadful habit, isn't it? Aren't you gonna ask about the fire thing? I just needed a segue. Good segue. Jacek smiled. Did you know that in hell you can make deals with just about anything, even the fire? I promised that I'd use it for a lot of destruction, and that I'd cause all the pain with it could ever wish for. So it's inside of me now. I stared at him in silence for a moment, swallowing the lump in my throat. I need to talk to my brother for a sec, I finally gritted out, shoving Cass inside and leaving Jacek on the porch to finish his smoke. Did you hear that? I whispered. That totally sounded like a threat, didn't it? He's gonna drag me to hell and then he'll burn down the woods. That's what you got from that exchange? Casimir asked, raising a brow. Why, what did you get? My brother cleared his throat, assuming a much deeper, gruffer voice to mimic Jacek. Hey baby girl, look how much cooler I've become since you last saw me. I can make fire now. I took a step back. What? Dude, that's not what's happening here. Casimir chuckled dryly. Oh, it so is. Anyways, it's not a threat. He was powerful even before you two broke up. Now, if he wanted to hurt us, he would have done it by now. Hard to argue with that. I still hated Cass for leaving me alone with my ex, but I could hardly force him to come. Especially since I was pretty sure I could handle myself. So I went back outside, informing Jacek that I was ready to go if he wanted to. Nice, but you were right before. He stepped just a little closer to me. This friend of mine we'll be meeting is technically my boss. The Holdu folk, as you know, pays a toll to hell by taking a life every now and then. Ergo, they answer to us. So if you were to convince my boss, he could order the Holdu folk to hide your land. Imagine the entire forest, surrounded by a charm that keeps outsiders from noticing it. Maybe folks would still read about the woods online, but if anyone else decided to come out here and explore, they simply wouldn't find anything. I nodded along. That would be great. And the Holdu folk can really do something like that? Oh yeah, they are the hidden people after all. They would never do it if you asked them to, but if it's a direct command from hell, they'd have to. Afterwards, you can take care of Tom Hayes, and that'll be it. He gave me a reassuring smile. Okay, but your boss, that's the devil, no? Sure, he said steadily. I'll have to sweet-talk the actual devil. Yep. Well, shit. Jacek threw his head back and shot a glance skyward, clearly discarding a sidelong comment. It's not so bad, he's a chill guy. He won't care that you don't pray to him. He's super accepting. Besides, he likes me a lot, so that's already a point in your favor. I sighed. Let's just go before I start overthinking this. How do we get there? Is there a portal in the mill or something? No. He plucked the cigarette from his lips. It was only then that I realized it looked kind of strange. It was black and red, and there was something written along the side in tiny letters. Fire, walk with me, Jacek said loudly as he tossed the cigarette into the snow at our feet. It immediately went up into flames, cutting a blazing red lane through the powdery white. Licorice perked up, running to Jacek's side and poking him with his snout. "Want to come along, boy? Ain't been home in a while, have you?" The miller raised his hand to pet the beast. He gestured for me to follow as he stepped right into the fire and started walking down the path. The dog trailed after him, wagging his tail. After glancing back to the house over my shoulder one last time and seeing Casimir wave to me from the window, I gave a deep sigh and followed Jacek Hitman into the dancing flames. As expected, the fire emanated no heat. These were welcoming flames. Their crackling sounded almost cheerful, and their light strongly stood out against the drizzly gray sky. The further we proceeded down this otherworldly path, the darker everything around us became. I soon realized that we weren't anywhere near the woods anymore, despite having only taken a few steps. This was like descending a staircase, only that I didn't know what was waiting on the floor below. I wondered if Casimir could still see us marching off from where he was standing, or if we'd already changed sides. It was hard to tell. Everything felt so surreal all of a sudden. The situation instilled within me a whole new kind of fear. It didn't know what to be frightened of, what to expect. I felt like I was being sucked into a black hole, and I was afraid I wouldn't come out as myself anymore. We were all alone in an empty, pitch-black space. I couldn't even see the ground we were walking on. I just kept taking step after step after step. Our surroundings defied logic and rational thinking, for despite the darkness, I could clearly see Jacek and the dog walking ahead. The miller seemed to be completely unmoved by this aura of existential dread his doorway emitted. He just walked on, pet beast by his side, eyes fixated on something I couldn't see. Mounting panic spurring me on, I ran to catch up with Jacek. He just smiled. "This isn't what you're used to, I know, but it'll be over soon. We're almost there." "Where is it that we are exactly?" "This is nowhere. It's only a corridor, a hallway. It'll lead us to one of Hell's populated junctions. The thing about Hell is that you never know what sphere you're in, but we'll just ask around. There's a sphere for every cardinal sin, and the boss's office is in Pride. There's these elevators everywhere, so we probably gotta take one to get us further down. Pride is the sphere that's all the way at the bottom. 'Cause it's the worst sin? Yeah, it puts you above God, 'cause God is the greatest and all that. Since you know the devil, have you met God too? Oh no, and I'd rather not. This is where I belong. And these days I can't even go near a church. Makes me sick. How's that?" Black magic contorts the practitioner's body. It jumbles up your insides. Your guts will be all over the place. They correspond to your thoughts, strong emotions, outward influences, stuff like that. That's why when I felt like you were breaking my heart, it just disappeared. Crumpled up and died. Jacek suddenly drew close again, whispering in my ear like he was sharing a secret. "If you were to cut me open right now, you could see my bowels writhing like a snake." Raising his head, he added, "Hey look, there's the door." There really was a door. A plain wooden door, in the middle of nothing. He reached for the door handle, resting his fingers on it but not pulling. "Hey, Fiona?" He sounded hesitant all of a sudden, and when he spoke he didn't look me in the eye. "Basically, I'd just like for you not to freak out and to trust me, I guess, if that's something you could do." He sighed, clearly trying to collect his thoughts. This was a weird moment to bring up what had happened between us, but it seemed to really gnaw at him. "Why haven't you asked me to reverse the wedding dress curse yet?" he inquired. "I don't know. I've gotten so used to it, it just wasn't on my mind." "That's good, because, well, I don't know how. Curses are weird sometimes. I acted purely on instinct when I did that to you, so I don't know. I don't know how to take it back." He shook his head with a wry smile. "I'm so incredibly sorry. I mean, I can live without my heart. I literally don't need any organs to survive, but I can't imagine going around in that big-ass dress has always been easy. I've almost died twice because of it," I admitted, shrugging. "Shit. Hey, I don't mind it. Not really. It's not in the way as long as I'm careful. And you can make it up to me if you just take me to see your boss," I said steadfastly. "Besides, I kinda think it's nice, very impractical, but nice. It, makes me feel pretty." "Okay," Jacek breathed, regarding me like he wasn't quite sure what to make of my response. "I mean, you are dreadfully pretty." His voice was all quiet again, but went back to normal after he swallowed audibly. He tugged the door open, and thus we set foot into Hell. I don't know what I was expecting, but it was definitely not this. There was a lot of light behind that door, red light, like in a club. The streets we suddenly found ourselves walking on were busy, full of people pushing and shoving. They actually looked pretty normal. Sure, some were missing a limb or part of their faces, but nothing too serious. Only a few of them were truly unsettling. The fact that almost everything was on fire was more disconcerting. The tops of the skyscrapers looming ahead, the sparse decorative trees, the storefronts and traffic signs. Jacek sighed, reaching into his pocket and producing a pair of sunglasses. "They really help with the brightness down here. I know it seems insufferable now, but you'll get used to it," he explained. "They suit you," I remarked. He grinned, tipping them down to give me a silly little wink. "Let's go." He stopped a couple people on our way, asking them where to find the nearest elevator. Eventually, we were directed to a building so tall it disappeared somewhere in the orange clouds above us. That's the shaft. We appear to be on Wrath, so we just have to go down a little ways. Pride is the next one, right below. Okay, I mumbled, head reeling. There was no line in front of the shaft, and mere seconds after being called, the elevator arrived with a bing. The door slowly slid open, revealing a red little room, only that it wasn't empty. I let out a sharp cry upon laying eyes on what was waiting inside. Describing it won't quite do it justice, but I'll try. It was an enormous spider, but it also wasn't. The two parts of its body were veiny and pulsing, not black or brown and furry like a normal spider would be, but made of actual human-looking skin and flesh. Its 8 eyes were, though varying in size, distinctly human, and its fangs a solid yellowish white. Its legs were more like a bunch of human arms and legs molten together, 6 hairy feet firmly planted on the floor, while its 2 front arms, which ended in hands, appeared to be knitting. It was by far the most horrifying and disgusting creature I'd ever seen, and I believe that's saying something coming from a person who has received involuntary hugs from a Vadyanoi, Jasek Tiskit, giving me an almost disapproving glance. He started towards the open doors, but I grabbed him, holding him back. "I'm not going in there," I hissed. "No way. Aw, come on. You've got to be kidding me. Ain't you face down far worse?" As a matter of fact, I haven't. My eyes kept darting between him and the spider. Licorice had already bounded into the small chamber. He was wagging his tail like he hadn't a care in the world, but I probably wouldn't either if I was his size. "So this is where you draw the line. She doesn't even look threatening. She's knitting, isn't that nice? Do you knit? Maybe you'll have something to talk about." "Jasek, please, can't we wait until she's off?" "I'm not going anywhere," the spider called out. "I'm elevator security." "See?" Jasek nodded, gesturing at the open doorway. "After you, madam." I grunted, shoving past him and into the cramped red room. Patting my skirt, I gave the spider a forced sidelong smile. And that's when it happened. Just as Jasek was about to enter, the doors closed, and before I could even think of stopping the horrid machine somehow, the cabin began its rapid descent, separating me from my trusty guide and leaving me alone, wedged between the spider and the hellhound. Ever lost your mom or dad at the grocery store when you were a kid? That's exactly how I felt when the prematurely closing elevator doors separated me from Jasek. I was grateful that Licorice was still there at least, but that didn't do much to distract me from the fact that I was plummeting down to the deepest level of hell without my trusty tour guide. The huge spider made of human body parts beside me honestly just made it all 10 times worse. I tried to keep it together, I really did. But when the cabin came to a halt and the doors opened, revealing a group of easily a dozen people waiting to push into the elevator, I could barely contain my frustration. Claustrophobia gnawing at me, I hastily shoved my way past the small crowd, closely followed by Licorice. I had to actually fight to get out. With everyone rushing into the opposite direction of me, the simple act of exiting the cabin turned into a physical struggle. At last, I staggered out onto the street, heart pounding. "Okay, stay where you are. Jasek's gonna find you." I tried to calm my nerves. Licorice soothingly licked the side of my face, and I gratefully dragged a weary hand over his scraggly fur. Everything would be all right. I'd just have to stay where I was and wait for Jasek to make his way over to me. Planting my feet firmly on the ground beside the elevator, I nervously stared at the shaft. I tried not to pay too much attention to my surroundings. The painful reality of my current situation had begun to sink in. These weren't my woods. I wasn't walking among the tall frost-painted trees. There was no snow to pleasantly crunch beneath my shoes, no winter sun smiling down at me. This was the very lowest sphere of hell, a densely populated city where everything was blazing flames and billowing smoke that swallowed the light. And worst of all, I had no idea what to expect of this place and its inhabitants. The Leshy was scary, yes. I never knew what to make of him either, but this was different. At home, the creatures were familiar. They terrified me, sure. They were all deadly in their own way, but I knew them. I had grown up with stories of them, with cautionary tales as well as humorous anecdotes. I was aware of how dangerous they were when at their worst, but also of how benign when at their best. Thus I had seen the best and the worst of the Leshy, but neither of anybody in this godforsaken hole. I felt alienated, completely helpless in the face of this foreign environment. Everything here was utterly unnatural. Nobody here was assuming a different form to hide their monstrous appearance. Nobody's voice was made to sound like a birdsong or the wind. This wasn't my world. I spun around upon hearing the ding of the elevator, and when Jacek stepped outside, I abandoned all thoughts of boundaries and dignity and threw myself into his arms. I didn't do it out of some romantic notion or to play the damsel in distress. I acted purely on impulse. I didn't get why at first either, but when Jacek wordlessly leaned in to hold me, I realized that this was familiar, comfortable even. I soaked up the feeling of safety he exuded like a sponge. Eventually, we awkwardly untangled ourselves, each having to look away for a moment and take some deep breaths. "You're shaking," he observed after a few seconds. "Uh-huh," was all I could manage to say. He snorted. "That is so... I never thought you could look this uneasy somewhere, anywhere. Honestly, when I took you down here, I thought it wouldn't be a problem for you." To my surprise, he didn't sound reproachful or condescending. Just genuinely surprised and a tad apologetic. "You're okay, right?" "Sure," I said quickly. "Lord, I'm sorry, gorgeous. Well, I'm here now. I'll stay close." It was all I could do not to ask him to hold my hand while walking. The streets in Pride were even more crowded than what I'd seen in Wrath. People kept shoving past us, getting uncomfortably close and brushing our shoulders with no regard for personal space. The fear of being trampled to death seemed concrete and imminent. Licorice helped cut our way through the bustle, but I still flinched every time I could feel a stranger's breath on my face or another arm touching mine. "Don't worry," Jacek said to me from the side. "They only care about themselves. What do you do down here anyways? Are these all sinners?" They were at one point. See, the boss has two main objectives for the lot of us. First, we obviously work on and encourage society's downfall as slowly and excruciatingly as possible. That's what I do on the surface. I only come here to attend meetings and go grocery shopping and stuff. Much cheaper than up top. "Oh yeah? What are you working on exactly?" I inquired. He lit up. "It'd take a while to explain. I'm on several different projects, but I'd love to show you sometime." He cleared his throat. "Once we're out of here, if you want to see..." "I'd love to," I replied in earnest. "So what's going on down here?" "Okay, so the folks around us actually work and live here. They were sinners at one point, but they never overdid it. The boss doesn't employ serial killers or tyrants or what have you. Those he actually detests, because they're doing to humanity what he wants to do. Encroaching on his territory, you know? Therefore, the real scum goes in the prisons. Each of the spheres has one, and these good people here spend eternity tormenting the inmates, which is something of a punishment in itself. Oh, and of course some people also run the stores and clubs and stuff like that, but the boss presides over all." "Oh, huh. I guess I always thought hell would be more medieval-like. Not a huge modern metropolis," I remarked. "How so? Corporate greed, working in a dead-end job until the end of time, an unfeeling boss who ruthlessly plays favorites and never gives you a word of appreciation unless you incessantly kiss his ass. So you're saying you're an ass kisser? The worst, but it's easy for me. I'm not like the rest. I willingly gave myself over to him. I didn't wait until I died. He just loves that, and seeing as it doesn't happen every day, I get the special treatment and the nicest jobs. I often run his personal errands too, like an old-time gentleman's servant." He chuckled. "It's great fun, really." "It was good you left the mill then. You seem to truly enjoy this," I muttered pensively, feeling an unwelcome, inexplicable sting in my chest. "Totally. All right, we made it. Look." He pointed up a building that would have put the Trump Tower to shame. It stood out among the others due to mere lavishness. Before I had more time to admire this impressive feat of architecture, Jacek had already started dragging me into the building's spacious lobby. He went right up to the desk where an annoyed-looking woman with short hair greeted him with little enthusiasm. Her mouth had been stitched shut, blood encrusting the seams. She couldn't talk properly, only pressing out short, muffled sentences. "Hey, Karen, is the boss in?" "Sure," she mumbled. "He's in his TV room. I'll tell him you're coming." "Thanks, you're a doll." Jacek led me up to another smaller elevator, lighting a cigarette as he went. "Is smoking indoors allowed here?" "It's strongly recommended." This elevator ride was much more harmonious, but I was still getting more and more tense the higher we got. When the elevator finally dinged its arrival, I was shaking like a leaf. "I'm going nuts," I confessed. "Not to make things awkward, but can you hug me again? Just for a second?" Jacek gave me a surprised look. Then he wordlessly turned to me, removing his cigarette from between his lips to hold it far away from me as his other arm snaked around my waist. My throat had suddenly gone bone dry. I pressed myself up against him for a mere moment until he pulled back, chuckling awkwardly and moving to step out through the opening doors. "Relax, the boss is chill. Okay, there we go." Jacek led me and his jumpy dog down a couple corridors before finally stopping in front of a black door. He knocked, and we waited for a beat until an annoyed-sounding voice told us to come in. Jacek held the door for me and we stepped inside. It was a nice large room with a big flat screen mounted to the wall and a cushy gray sofa facing it. While this room was a relatively tame sight, the person, or rather creature, standing in the middle of it instantly drew a scream from my throat. He was the size of a person, but at the same time that of a bull or a football field, or maybe a whole continent, despite being able to fit into that room. He turned to us with a smile that had too many teeth and also none at all. When he opened his mouth to speak, I stared down into a black, endless hole. I didn't know what I was seeing. My mind was howling, trying to comprehend, trying to piece these conflicting impressions together. My thoughts were racing, my heart pounding. The longer I looked at this thing, the more everything seemed to spin out of control. I fell to my knees. Why couldn't I understand this? Were my eyes deceiving me? Was this real? Was anything real? No, nothing was real anymore. Nothing was true. Nothing could be believed. "Oh, I see we've got company." A rich, gentle baritone cut through my frantic haze, and suddenly I wasn't looking at something incomprehensible anymore. What was standing there in front of us wasn't a cosmic nightmare anymore. It was a man, leaning casually against the back of the couch. A normal-looking, middle-aged guy with a gray-streaked beard and an open, carefree smile. He was barefoot, only dressed in sweatpants and a t-shirt. "Lovely. Jacek, I'll go out on a whim here and assume that this little firecracker is the infamous Fiona Novak?" "She is. Fiona, this is, well, my boss," Jacek said. I slowly got to my feet and walked over to the man, the devil, reaching out to take his extended hand. It was warm and soft. "It's a pleasure to meet you. Call me Nick." "Hi," I croaked. It's good to meet you too. Sorry about before. I sometimes forget that my appearance is an acquired taste," he said, squeezing my fingers with distinct pleasure. "So, as I am prone to understand, you've been brought here by Mr. Hetman to ask a favor of me." "Yes, sir. Nick." Suddenly, we were on the other side of the couch. We hadn't moved an inch, not on our own accord, and yet we found ourselves closer to the TV by several feet. The devil plopped down, sighing contentedly. "Sit," he commanded. Jacek took a seat beside him and I followed suit, thankful for the shield my former boyfriend established between the beast and myself. Despite not seeming put off by the unsettling nature of the other man in the slightest, he appeared to be acutely aware of my own discomfort. "Nice try, Jacek." Without having gotten up, the devil was now sitting by my other side, uncomfortably close. "I'll thank you not to play the knight in shining armor. Now, Miss Novak, you're not really an advocate or follower of mine, are you?" His tone didn't sound accusatory in the least. "What makes you think you can come in here and accost me?" he asked genially. I squirmed uneasily, avoiding his gaze, not sure how to handle these conflicting messages. "I guess I just need help," I stammered. "We all do sometimes." The man put an arm around me, pulling me close and rubbing my shoulder. Jacek jumped to his feet, staring at his employer in shock. The devil laughed, letting go of me and waving him off. Cool your jets, Miller. If I wanted her, I would have had her already. Look at how she's shrinking away. He leaned forward, tapping Jasek's belly. If I wanted her, I could make her like it. Her response would be quite different then. I couldn't help but gag slightly in the back of my throat. I tried not to show it, tried to swallow it up. No use in antagonizing the being I was about to ask a huge favor of, as much as I would have liked to. Jasek lowered himself back down, chest heaving. The devil regarded Jasek with unrestrained amusement. Forgive me, son, but I simply had to know. Know what? I inquired, feeling a tad dense. The devil shrugged. Unimportant. All right, Fiona, state your case. What is it that you want me to do for you? You command the hidden people, don't you? They pay you a toll, after all. Do go on. I have a plot of land. I need it to be veiled somehow, obscured by magical means. People have been trying and succeeding to access it. Thought of putting up a fence? Sure, but the Leshy doesn't want that. He'd gut me. He's a bit odd. Oh yeah, I have a Leshy on my land. Nick grinned. You sure do. So, you want me to order the Holdu folk to hide it? Yes. An agonizing period of silence ensued. Then the devil shrugged. Yeah, okay. What, that easy? Would you prefer I give you a series of inhumanely cruel tasks to complete in order to win my benevolence? No, I hastened to reply. Good. The woods shall be hidden from all except those you choose to inaugurate. Consider it done. He gave me a cheerful smile. You kids want a beer? Gladly, Jasek muttered. The second the word had left his lips, he and I were both holding a large can of Guinness each. Cheers. The miller clinked his can against mine as I merely stared down at it in confusion. And there's nothing I have to do in return? I asked Nick, 'cause you made it seem that way before. I did, didn't I? He smirked, clearly satisfied with himself. No, don't bother. Truth be told, I really like the Novak children. You're my third favorite. How come? We haven't met before, have we? No, but let's just say that I love the Black Miller very much, and he's told me quite a bit about you. Oh, great, I gritted out, giving Jasek a sidelong glare that made him hide his face behind the drink. I've already met your brothers, of course. That is to say, most of them. I nearly spat out a mouthful of beer. You needn't look so surprised, Nick remarked. You've met Marion? Is he here? I almost cried out. No, the guy upstairs never lets me have any of the children. Well, most of the time at least. He took Marion, and honestly, I'm happy he did. Little pest that he was. I came to see him when he was waiting in purgatory, and he kicked me in the shin and told me to go to hell. Can you believe it? He laughed quietly. I remember it like it was yesterday. But that was before I learned more about you all. As for the one you call Casimir, I'm sure you'll know where he'll end up once his mortal body fails him. I drew in a slow breath. I suppose I can imagine. He's a good boy. I'll welcome him with open arms. The hunger that man displays, that unfeeling, lustful, entirely self-serving nature, seems awfully devoted to you, though. The devil shrugged. I watch him occasionally. I just love his coping mechanisms, you know. I appreciate that kind of behavior. I guess you would. Cass is a pretty winning guy. Definitely, and then there's Jeremy. I flinched so hard some beer spilled from my can. Nick smiled very, very sweetly. You haven't seen that one in a bit, have you? Do you know what became of him? I never found out, I confessed. The devil leaned in closer. Want me to show you? Fiona, no. Jasek chimed in. Turning to Nick, he added, We should go now. Thanks for your time, boss. I'll see you on Sunday. Wait, I want to see. It was against my own better judgment that I contradicted Jasek. But the truth of the matter was that I hadn't seen or heard from Jim ever since he had cut contact with me and the rest of my family over a decade ago. I had tried to look him up a bunch of times, but never found anything. Perhaps he'd chosen to change his name. Jasek swallowed audibly. It would really be better if you didn't. I was kind of surprised he would know anything about my younger brother, but before I could address his concerns, Nick had produced a remote and switched on the big TV across from us. I instantly pressed my hands over my ears as incoherent screaming and agonized wails rang out. The can of beer fell to the floor, its contents flowing freely over the carpet. More disturbing yet, however, was the image presented to me on screen. It was a man, not much younger than me, resembling distinctly the memories I had of Jem in our youth. He was handsome, not quite as much as Casimir, but definitely appealing. Or rather, he must have been at some point. As it was, though, he looked almost like a living corpse. He was wholly nude, drenched in blood that streamed out of several gashes all over his body. Under different circumstances, he'd have probably already bled to death, but he was still standing, bleeding, bleeding, bleeding. He was in a dimly lit holding cell. In the corner, a pile of what I reluctantly identified as feces, and he kept throwing himself against the bars again and again, howling like a madman. It was horrifying beyond measure. I couldn't say a thing, merely covering my eyes helplessly until Nick turned off the TV and the noises ceased. Well, I reckon that was a bit distressing to see, but trust me, he's getting what he deserves. I don't take kindly to people who seek to topple humanity themselves. That's my show to run. He let go of a soft sigh. Jeremy Novak, serial killer. Never got caught to face a human jury, and after number 42, I just had to intercede. So I sent someone to prematurely collect his soul for me. He gave me a swift pet on the knee, and I bet you can guess who. Trudging through the snow once again, I hugged my upper body, more aware of the sting of the cold, now that we had just emerged from this pit of heat, fire, and despair. Jacek followed right behind me, his dog trailing along demurely. "I'm sorry," Jacek called out to me for about the third time in the last 10 minutes. I didn't respond, but I did slow down, allowing him to catch up with me. "I'm sorry," he repeated, and I dropped my arms. "I'm not mad," I said softly. "Really? Not at you specifically," I specified. "Kind of at everyone." "Everyone. Absolutely everyone, ever," I muttered. "I thought you'd be angry at me for not telling you. I'm glad you didn't tell me. Yeah, part of me kinda wishes you did, but I get it. And now I wish I'd listened to you back there. Think I'd be happier not knowing. I understand." We continued to walk on in silence. "Okay, back to normal," I said, dropping my arms. "Just like that? Hey, I can't keep writing this out, can I?" I put on what I hoped to be a cheerful smile. I hardly knew Jeremy anyways. Could have been anyone. "Sure," Jacek mumbled. "But this isn't like something where you doubt yourself based on the actions of your family members, right? Maybe there's just a little bit of that." "Well, there shouldn't be. You're not a saint, but you're still pretty amazing." "Amazing?" I echoed, raising a brow at him. "I mean, well, you know," he stammered, coloring. "I just think you're pretty great. See, I thought when you and I would meet again, it'd be awful. I figured we'd be at each other's throats in an instant, and that you'd resent me for cursing you, and that I'd feel all the disappointment and the rage again. But you don't seem to, and I didn't, so yeah, I just think that's nice. If you thought it'd be so horrible, then why'd you come?" "You asked me to," he said quietly. "That's to say, you asked me for help, so it was just the decent thing to do." I came to a halt in front of the porch, turning to face him. "And if I hadn't asked for help? If I hadn't asked for your help and simply wanted to see you, would you have come then?" Jacek stared at me, inky black eyes deep and unreadable. He swallowed audibly, then opened his mouth to speak. Before he could say anything, the door swung open. Cass was upon me in the blink of an eye, pulling me into a hug. "Thank God you're finally back," I was starting to get worried. "We're all right," I assured him. "The devil was rather cooperative." "Was he creepy?" I shuddered. "You don't even want to know. Just be glad you didn't come along." "I am. I made some excellent progress over here," my little brother explained proudly. A mischievous glint in his eyes, he reached into the pocket of his sweater and pulled out a black woolen hat. "Is that Tom's? How'd you get it?" I inquired, voice shrill with amazement. "Simplicity itself, my dear Watson." Cass grinned and fingered the hat fondly. "I figured I should work towards you to some extent. I got this little bug in my brain that Hayes wasn't really the popular type, so I went over to him for a chat. Let me tell you, That man is starved for attention. He didn't even mind that I'm like literally your brother. He didn't mention the blackmail in his online endeavors, of course, but it turns out he's a total weeb, and he went on about anime for hours. And I do mean hours. I kept waiting for him to lose something, and eventually, I just asked if I could borrow his hat because my ears were getting cold. I just kept it on and kept him rambling. And then when that was finally over, I just walked off with his hat still on. He didn't even notice. That was so smart, I praised him, knowing exactly what he wanted to hear. Thank you, thank you. I'm glad you know it. It was, after all, a hell of its own. He tossed Jasek the hat, who caught it in midair and proceeded to hold it out for Licorice to sniff. I'm gonna need some time with the pooch now, he announced. Could take a while to make him understand what I want him to do, but I'm optimistic. Need any help? I offered. No, you two go on and catch up, it's fine. Casimir and I retired into the kitchen to have a chat. It was already late in the afternoon and darkness had settled comfortably over the treetops. Cass was very eager to hear about hell, asking me a bunch of questions and trying to get as many details as possible. I told him what the devil had said about him, and once he'd let that sink in, I shared what I'd learned about Jem. Cass was shocked, but he took it a little better than I had. Jasek returned late in the evening. He would undoubtedly spend the night, so I prepared one of the guest rooms for him. He was leaning in the doorframe, watching me as I changed the sheets after rejecting his help several times. You've already saved my skin, it's the least I can do, I insisted. I hope the Leshy's off your case now. He should be. A deal's a deal. Good. So what'll you do about Hayes? Jasek asked. He's obviously a threat. I mean, he somehow acquired your soul, right? And he had to have known that it was yours. How? How did he find out? I drew myself up, swallowing. He was right. I hadn't actually thought of that yet, not at length at least. What do you recommend? Jasek's face lit up. Well, where I come from, and you've seen where I come from, we have a ton of specialists who'd be perfectly capable of getting the answers you need. So you'd opt for torture? Definitely. Okay, let's assume that I don't. Jasek snorted, spewing a tiny flame as he let out a soft laugh. All right, I'll try to come up with something else, but just so you know, I've got the necessary connections. I stared at him for a moment, eyes wide and lips curved, the man with fire in his throat. I'm very glad you came, Jasek. So am I. His voice had gone several notches lower. But as for what you said before, no, I think I wouldn't have come if it had just been to see you. That's over. I'm sorry. I bit my lip hard, lowering my head and nodding. I understand. I guess I misread things, I said softly, giving him a strained smile as I walked out. I didn't go to bed. My mind was a whirl with pent-up warmth and unwelcome emotions, and thus I stepped out onto the porch. Darkness had settled over the treetops, bringing with it a soothing quiet. I stood and listened to the silence. Eventually, I picked up on laughter, talking, and, weirdly enough, coughing coming from the direction of the sauna. Apparently, the Bannock was hosting one of his social gatherings. That was honestly just perfect, even though it sure didn't feel that way. I reluctantly stepped off the porch and began stomping my way through the snow across the yard. Once at the sauna, I took a deep breath, steadying myself and reaching out to knock at the door. With each time my knuckles collided with the surface, my anxiety mounted. The door was opened and the Bannock stood before me, looking up in confusion. Good evening. I'm sorry to disturb, but I was hoping I could join you and your friends for the night. The Bannock's eyes widened in astonishment. He was silent for a moment, then said in that eerie voice of his, "Shed your clothes and come in." I followed him inside, swallowing the lump in my throat as I entered the half-light of the changing room. There were a couple tunics lying on the benches, and just as I'd expected, a cudgel and a caftan. They'd been tossed aside with surprisingly little care. In the other room, the conversation was getting more animated, and there was also that coughing again. It didn't sound right. I slowly started taking off my dress, trying to keep my thoughts in order. The Bannock didn't stop me from discarding my underwear as well, so I figured that was simply the way. I didn't really have a problem with it. Bracing myself, I stepped into the sweltering heat. Immediately, there were several pairs of eyes on me. Most of the Bannock's guests were unfamiliar to me, but their humanoid features and uncanny smiles and giggles caused me to assume they were part of the clan of fairies that roams the woods. No, not the hidden people, different fairies. There's all kinds of them. One face was distinctly familiar to me, though. Harris. The Leshy's voice came from over in the corner. He sat cross-legged, hands on his knees, broad shoulders relaxed. He grinned, then patted the spot on the bench beside him. "Sit with me." He sounded weirdly restrained and polite. I slowly walked up to him and placed my clenching ass next to his. There was a brief touch of skin that made me flinch. He shifted his weight slightly. "Well, you needn't sit quite so close," he added in an amused tone. "I meant no disrespect," I sputtered. "That wasn't my impression either." He looked at me in a calculating way, and I quickly scooted to bring a bit more distance between us, which was difficult considering I didn't want to get too close to the lady sitting at my other side either. She let out a most unbecoming snort, breaking into a laugh that sounded like waves breaking on a rocky shore. Needless to say, it creeped me the hell out. "And who is she now?" the woman asked into the round, pointing at me. "A friend of mine." The Bannock's voice echoed off the walls. "She has been invited. She's got every right to be here." The lady threw her hands up. "I'm not complaining. I was just a bit surprised is all." She leaned towards me, damp red hair falling over her shoulder. She smelled of rosemary and honey, and maybe some other herbs I didn't recognize. I tried not to be so obvious about sucking it in, but she noticed anyway. "What's your name, beautiful?" she asked, pale red lips stretching into a grin. "She's the heiress," the Leshy answered in my stead. "If you try to steal her name, I'll rip you apart." "Ooh, calm down. I wasn't trying to mess with your maid." "She's no more my maid than you are my grandmother. Stop running your mouth if you know what's good for you." I chuckled a bit at his response. I had no idea why he was defending me, but for what it was worth, I appreciated it. The Leshy turned to face me with something akin to kindness in his gaze. "Something's changed," he remarked. "I noticed it earlier. I solved our outsider problem. Came here to tell you." "I see. I did what you asked. I know. You're free of your obligations towards me." He drew in a deep breath. How he was able to bear the heat without batting an eye was beyond me. I hadn't taken a steam in ages, but I didn't remember it being this hot. "I'm not," I contradicted, shifting in my seat. "Something's wrong with you, isn't there?" He opened his mouth to answer but broke into a coughing fit instead. It was whooping and audibly painful. It sounded bad. His face contorted in an expression of intense discomfort. I couldn't help but notice how vulnerable he looked, just like I'd suspected. The other spirits seemingly didn't care about it in the least, causing me to assume that it had been going on for a while. The fit worsened, the bearded man doubling over. I instinctively moved to steady him, pressing my palm to his bare chest. After a couple more minutes, he calmed down and, not ungently, brushed my arm aside. "How long have you been sick for?" I asked. "Is it because of the buys?" "Not here," he wheezed. "You're gonna have to tell me sometime." "What if I don't want to?" "It'll pass. I don't need your help." "It won't, and you do." I leaned closer, hesitantly, to talk into his ear. "I'd be facing an assload of trouble if something were to happen to you. I'm not doing this out of charity, and I don't pity you, nor do I think you're old or weak or pathetic. So come off it." The Leshy stayed silent for a moment, holding my gaze before rising to his feet. "Let's step outside for a moment." That's when the red-haired woman spoke up again. "Where do you think you two are going?" "We need to talk, privately," I said steadily. She didn't seem to like that. Something in her eyes flared, and she bared her teeth as she spoke. "That's against the rules." "What rules?" I inquired. "What rules?" she repeated. "It's rude. You're being incredibly rude. First you join our round, breaking right into our gathering, and now you're leaving prematurely." I rubbed my temples. I knew I shouldn't argue. I knew it was pointless and likely dangerous, but I was simply pissed, and now this chick was on my case. Look, I don't really care, no offense, but I don't give a shit about you folks' manners and stuff, not tonight. She rose from her seat, glaring daggers. Beg pardon, mistress, did I hear that right? You don't get to talk to me like that, heiress or not. Get over yourself, I hissed. You're twice as vain as you ought to be, considering whose land you're on. Oh, here. The redhead whipped around to face the leshy. And you? Do you appreciate her tone? She snorted. You're just going to let her lay claim to what's yours? The leshy smiled thinly. Don't try to pit me against her. You really are getting old. You're already frail enough to submit yourself to a mortal wench, the woman spat. I'm not submitting myself to anyone. Will you shut your mouth? I snapped at her, taking a bold step forward despite myself. Stop dragging him into this. Eris, don't... The leshy began, but before he could say anything, the redhead lunged at me. I let out a scream of shock as she knocked me to the ground, but was quick enough to dig my nails into her wrist and bring her down with me. Now, face to face with her, my pulse began to race and fear pooled in the pit of my stomach. What the hell was I doing? I rolled over, knocking her off of me. The back of her head collided with the floor, and I staggered to my feet as she groaned and hissed in pain. She sneered at me as her companions rose to her feet, allowing me to fully take in their, on second glance, disturbingly twisted bodies. One had legs that bent in two places each like a double knee. Another had wrists as wide as his hands and feet that were turned inside out with the heel in the front, and the toes facing his backside. Another still pulled her unruly bangs aside to reveal a third eye. Dread had crept into my chest and taken hold of me, and I couldn't contain it any longer when these unnatural humanoids grabbed me by my wrists and ankles and began dragging me down again. The bannock yelled at them, shooing them off, but it only lasted for a moment. I was still trying to push myself up into a sitting position when one of the ferrymen knelt down beside me, grabbing my arm and sinking 3 rows of teeth into it. They were misshapen and pointy, like broken glass, and when he dragged them across my skin, lacing it with saliva, they tore through it like paper. I struggled, trying to get away from him, but my muscles wouldn't cooperate. Caught in a panicked rigor, it was as if my bones had turned into jelly. I let out a cry of fear and pain. Suddenly the ferry was forcefully pulled back, and I found the leshy standing over me, screaming down the others. I tilted my head at him as he bent down, and for some reason felt compelled to reach out and bury my fingers in his hair. He leaned in, frowning in confusion. Are you all right? Yeah, I panted, allowing him to help me up. I shouldn't have said anything. I'm sorry, I didn't want to cause a fight. I thought it was perfectly reasonable, he replied, watching the trickle of blood on my arm with narrowed eyes. Still, I sighed, raising my hands. Everyone, let's calm down. I mean no harm. I didn't want to disrupt the peace here tonight, but just give me a break. I'm having a shit time at the moment. The lady with the red hair stared at me, chest heaving. I held her gaze with tight lips. To my surprise, she suddenly stepped forward and pulled me into her arms, stroking my bare back. I pressed my face against her neck, sucking in her scent. Something changed. The others slowly closed in on us. I felt fingers gently rubbing my shoulders, then a tongue grazing my lower arm, licking clean the wound. The odd congregation turned into a heap of flesh, suddenly warm and inviting. I closed my eyes, allowing myself to get lost in it. I woke up sprawled out on my porch, once again wearing my wedding dress. It had been sloppily pulled over my shoulders and not entirely closed up. Several tunics had been draped over my upper body, their owners nowhere to be seen. I glanced around, realizing that the leshy was sitting next to me. He was awake already, lazily blinking into the cold winter sun. Upon noticing I had joined the land of the living once more, he staggered to his feet, gripping the banister for support. He wiped his sweaty brow and broke into another coughing fit. He looked a frightful lot smaller than in the little dark room before. Come see me on the Red Meadow tomorrow morning. Try getting some rest in the meantime. Don't even... Do I still have all my hands and feet? Did anyone bite something off? No. Well, you nearly did, but I won't go into that. He tilted his head, clearly thinking of something amusing as a smile tugged on the corner of his mouth. My lifeless eyes are up here, I said, pointing at my face. Sure, You were something to behold last night. I raked a hand through my hair. That was, well, I'm not gonna lie and say it wasn't fun, but don't expect it to happen again. And I don't want this to spread. Please just forget all about it. Not a word to anyone, you got me. Especially not the blackmailer, I assume. He let out a resounding laugh. I sighed. It won't make any difference to him, I said under my breath, but I have a reputation to uphold. He regarded me, mirth gleaming in his eyes. I won't bandy your name. See you tomorrow, Fiona.